Metformin, the world's most prescribed diabetes drug, taken by over 150 million people every single day. It was derived from a plant called French lilac, Galega officinalis, and medieval physicians had been prescribing that exact plant for what they called sweet urine disease for 700 years before any pharmaceutical company synthesized its active compound into a pill. 700 years. That one fact reframes everything about blood sugar medicine. Today I am ranking 21 foods from ancient biblical and historical texts by the strength of their clinical evidence for blood sugar control. My name is Elias Harper. This is the Covenant Table. Subscribe before we start. No sponsors, no supplements, just the research. Let us go. Before the list, a framework. Because blood sugar science has specific vocabulary and the mechanisms matter, type 2 diabetes is fundamentally a disease of insulin resistance. The pancreas produces insulin, the hormone that signals cells to absorb glucose from the bloodstream. In insulin resistance, cells stop responding to that signal. Glucose accumulates in the blood. The pancreas compensates by producing more insulin. Eventually, it cannot keep up. The progression from normal blood sugar to insulin resistance to pre-diabetes to type 2 diabetes takes years, sometimes decades. And during that entire window, dietary intervention is the most powerful tool available. Metformin works primarily through three mechanisms. It reduces glucose production by the liver, improves insulin sensitivity in muscle cells, and slows glucose absorption from the gut. Every food on today's list earns its place by demonstrating clinical evidence for at least one of those same mechanisms, or by addressing a fourth mechanism that metformin does not, directly stimulating insulin secretion from the pancreas, or reducing postprandial glucose spikes through gut-level enzyme inhibition. That is the standard. Let us start at 21. Number 21. Cucumbers. Cucumbers appear across ancient Near Eastern dietary records and are specifically named by the Israelites in the Book of Numbers among the foods they missed from Egypt. Ancient Egyptian physicians prescribed cucumber preparations for conditions involving excess thirst and frequent urination, symptoms we now recognize as hallmarks of uncontrolled diabetes. The blood sugar mechanism for cucumbers is modest but real. Cucumbers contain cucurbitacins, compounds that have demonstrated inhibitory activity against alpha-glucosidase, the enzyme that breaks down complex carbohydrates into glucose in the small intestine. Alpha-glucosidase inhibition is the same mechanism used by the pharmaceutical drug acarbose, a common diabetes medication. Additionally, cucumbers have exceptionally low glycemic load, meaning they produce virtually no blood glucose spike, while providing hydration that supports kidney function in managing excess glucose through urine. A 2010 study found cucumber extract produced measurable reductions in blood glucose in diabetic animal models through this enzyme inhibition mechanism. The human clinical data is preliminary, which is why cucumbers rank 21st. The ancient physicians who noted that cucumbers helped patients with excessive thirst were observing, without knowing the mechanism, the alpha-glucosidase inhibitory effect of cucurbitacins on postprandial glucose absorption. Number 20. Onions. Onions appear alongside cucumbers in that same passage of Numbers, and their blood sugar evidence is meaningfully stronger. Onions contain quercetin and the compound allyl propyl disulfide, both of which have documented hypoglycemic effects through distinct mechanisms. Quercetin inhibits alpha-glucosidase, the same enzyme inhibited by cucurbitacins, but also inhibits aldose reductase, an enzyme involved in the conversion of glucose to sorbitol. Sorbitol accumulation in cells is one of the mechanisms behind diabetic neuropathy, nerve damage caused by chronically elevated blood glucose. Quercetin's aldose reductase inhibition addresses not just blood glucose levels, but one of the downstream complications of elevated glucose. Allyl propyl disulfide competes with insulin for breakdown sites in the liver, effectively extending insulin's active time in the bloodstream and enhancing its glucose lowering effect. A 2010 randomized controlled trial published in Environmental Health Insights tested fresh red onion consumption in type 2 diabetic subjects and found significant reductions in fasting blood glucose after just 4 weeks. The effect was dose-dependent: more onion, lower glucose. The ancient world that consumed onions daily as a dietary staple was simultaneously extending insulin activity and inhibiting the enzyme responsible for postprandial glucose spikes. Ancient empirical observation. Modern endocrinology. Same food, same result. Number 19. Bitter melon. Bitter melon, Momordica charantia, does not appear by name in the canonical Hebrew Bible, but it grows throughout the ancient Near East and is referenced in ancient Ayurvedic texts, Egyptian medical papyri, and traditional Chinese medical literature dating back thousands of years. In every medical tradition that encountered it, bitter melon was prescribed for the cluster of symptoms we now call diabetes. The clinical evidence is substantial and the mechanism unusually well characterized. Bitter melon contains at least 3 distinct compounds with hypoglycemic activity, charantine, which has been shown to be more potent than the pharmaceutical drug tolbutamide in reducing blood glucose in animal studies, polypeptide, a plant insulin that acts similarly to human insulin, and vicine, a compound with insulin secretagogue properties that stimulates pancreatic beta cells to produce more insulin. A 2011 randomized controlled trial published in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology tested bitter melon preparation in type 2 diabetic subjects and found significant reductions in fructosamine, a marker of average blood glucose over the preceding 2 to 3 weeks. The effect was clinically meaningful. The ancient physicians of India, China, and Egypt who prescribed bitter melon for sweet urine disease had identified a plant with 3 independent blood glucose lowering mechanisms. Modern endocrinology has characterized all 3. The ancient prescription was not approximating effective treatment. It was effective treatment. Number 18. Flaxseed. Flaxseed appears in ancient Egyptian agricultural records and is referenced in the Book of Exodus. We established its cardiovascular and hormonal evidence in previous videos. For blood sugar specifically, flaxseed has a precise and well-documented mechanism. Flaxseed's primary blood sugar action comes from its viscous soluble fiber, specifically mucilage, which forms a gel in the small intestine that physically slows glucose absorption. This is not a systemic hormonal effect. It is a mechanical gut-level intervention that reduces the rate at which glucose enters the bloodstream after a meal. A 2011 randomized controlled trial in type 2 diabetic subjects found that flaxseed supplementation for 12 weeks produced significant reductions in fasting blood glucose, HbA1c, the 3-month average blood glucose marker, and insulin resistance scores compared to placebo. The lignans in flaxseed add a second mechanism. They have documented activity as PPAR gamma activators. PPAR gamma is the same receptor targeted by the thiazolidine ione class of pharmaceutical diabetes drugs, including pioglitazone, which improve insulin sensitivity in fat and muscle tissue. A plant fiber that mechanically slows glucose absorption. A lignin that activates the same receptor as a pharmaceutical insulin sensitizer. From a seed that ancient Egyptian physicians prescribed because they observed it helped patients with metabolic complaints. Number 17. Leeks. Leeks appear in numbers alongside cucumbers and onions. Their blood sugar relevance is primarily through prebiotic fiber, and the gut-glucose connection is more direct than most people realize. Leeks are rich in fructooligosaccharides and inulin, prebiotic fibers that selectively feed Bifidobacterium and Lactobacillus species in the gut. These bacteria, when well nourished, produce short-chain fatty acids, including butyrate and propionate, that have documented effects on glucose metabolism. Propionate specifically has been shown in clinical research to stimulate the release of peptide YY and GLP-1, gut hormones that slow gastric emptying, reduce appetite, and improve insulin sensitivity. GLP-1 is the hormone targeted by the now famous GLP-1 receptor agonist drugs, including semaglutide, the active compound in Ozempic, which have become the most prescribed weight management and diabetes drugs in history. Leeks and other prebiotic foods stimulate endogenous GLP-1 production through gut bacterial fermentation. Pharmaceutical companies synthesize GLP-1 receptor agonists and sell them for hundreds of dollars per injection per week. The mechanism is the same. The delivery system is the difference. And the ancient world was consuming the foods that stimulate natural GLP-1 production as a daily dietary baseline. Number 16. Pomegranate. Pomegranate's cardiovascular and gut health evidence we have established. For blood sugar specifically, pomegranate has a targeted mechanism that places it at 16. Pomegranate contains punicolagens and ellagic acid, polyphenols, that have demonstrated specific inhibitory activity against alpha amylase and alpha glucosidase, the two enzymes responsible for carbohydrate digestion and glucose release in the small intestine. Inhibiting both enzymes simultaneously produces a more complete reduction in postprandial glucose elevation than inhibiting either alone. A 2014 randomized controlled trial found that pomegranate juice consumption significantly reduced postprandial blood glucose in healthy subjects after a standardized high-carbohydrate meal. The effect was attributable to the dual enzyme inhibition mechanism. Additionally, pomegranate's anti-inflammatory polyphenols address chronic inflammation, which is both a driver and a consequence of insulin resistance. The inflammatory cytokines produced in excess adipose tissue, particularly TNF-alpha and IL-6, directly impair insulin receptor signaling. Reducing those cytokines, as pomegranate polyphenols do, improves insulin sensitivity through a systemic rather than gut-level mechanism. Ancient physicians prescribed pomegranate for metabolic complaints across multiple civilizations. The dual enzyme inhibition mechanism and anti-inflammatory insulin sensitization explain precisely what they were observing. Number 15. Olive oil. In the blood sugar context, olive oil earns its place through a mechanism distinct from its cardiovascular and anti-inflammatory effects. Extra virgin olive oil consumed with meals significantly reduces postprandial insulin secretion, not by lowering glucose, but by improving insulin efficiency. The oleic acid in olive oil stimulates the release of GLP-1 from intestinal L cells, the same mechanism we identified for leak prebiotic fiber, producing more efficient insulin signaling and reduced pancreatic strain. A 2016 randomized controlled trial found that adding extra virgin olive oil to a high glycemic meal reduced postprandial glucose response by 22% compared to the same meal without olive oil. The mechanism was confirmed as GLP-1 mediated. Long-term, the pre-diamide trial subgroup analysis for diabetes outcomes found that subjects in the olive oil arm showed a 40% reduction in new-onset type 2 diabetes compared to the low-fat control group over 5 years. 40% reduction in new-onset diabetes from consuming extra virgin olive oil as a daily dietary fat. The ancient world cooked with olive oil as its primary fat for 5,000 years. The Remedies trial quantified the metabolic protection that daily use produced across a population. Number 14. Garlic. Garlic's blood sugar evidence is broader and more consistent across human clinical trials than most people realize. A 2016 meta-analysis published in the Journal of Nutrition analyzed 9 randomized controlled trials of garlic supplementation in type 2 diabetic subjects. The pooled analysis found significant reductions in fasting, blood glucose, HbA1c, total cholesterol, and triglycerides across all included trials. The mechanism involves allisin's effects on pancreatic beta cells, the cells that produce insulin. Allicin has been shown to increase insulin secretion by protecting beta cells from oxidative damage and by stimulating the glucose sensing pathways that trigger insulin release. A second mechanism, allicin inhibits hepatic glucose production, the liver's release of stored glucose into the bloodstream overnight. This is one of the primary drivers of elevated fasting blood glucose in type 2 diabetes. Metformin's primary mechanism is also hepatic glucose production inhibition. Garlic and metformin address the same primary mechanism, liver glucose output, through different molecular pathways. The ancient world that consumed raw garlic daily was inhibiting hepatic glucose production as a matter of dietary routine without any knowledge of the liver's role in blood sugar regulation. Number 13. Lentils. Lentils earned a high position in every previous ranking. For blood sugar specifically, lentils belong at 13 because the clinical evidence for their glycemic effects is among the most robust of any food in this entire list. We established lentils' resistant starch content, the starch that travels intact to the large intestine and feeds gut bacteria rather than spiking blood glucose. In the blood sugar context, this mechanism is critical. A 2019 randomized controlled trial published in Diabetologia specifically tested lentil substitution, replacing a portion of high glycemic foods with lentils, in subjects across a range of glycemic status. The findings, substituting lentils for just 50% of high glycemic carbohydrates, produced a 35% reduction in postprandial blood glucose, significant reductions in HbA1c over 12 weeks, and measurable improvements in insulin resistance scores. 35% reduction in postprandial glucose from a food that costs less than $2 per pound. The second mechanism, lentils' protein content, approximately 18 grams per cooked cup, produces a strong satiety effect that reduces overall caloric intake at subsequent meals, addressing the energy surplus that drives insulin resistance over time. The ancient world that traded birthrights for lentil stew was eating one of the most clinically validated anti-diabetic foods available. The research keeps returning to the same conclusion. The ancient prescription was right. Number 12. Dates. Dates present a counterintuitive finding that I want to address directly, because most people with blood sugar concerns have been told to avoid them. Dates are 50 to 80% sugar by weight. Their glycemic index, however, ranges from 35 to 55 depending on variety, classifying them as low to medium glycemic index foods despite their high sugar content. The mechanism: dates contain a complex fiber matrix, including pectin, beta-glucan, and hemicellulose, that slows glucose absorption so significantly that the postprandial glucose spike from date consumption is markedly lower than from other high-sugar foods. A 2011 clinical study published in Nutrition Journal tested 5 varieties of dates in both healthy and diabetic subjects, measuring glycemic index and postprandial glucose response. In the diabetic subjects specifically, the group most at risk from high-sugar foods, all 5 date varieties produced low to moderate glycemic responses, leading the researchers to conclude that dates are safe for diabetic consumption and may be beneficial for metabolic health due to their fiber and polyphenol content. The ancient world that consumed dates throughout the day as portable food was not spiking its blood glucose. The fiber matrix of the whole date was moderating the glucose release from its own sugars, a natural slow-release mechanism that modern food science is now documenting. We are at the midpoint, and the top 11 is where the clinical evidence becomes genuinely extraordinary. Before we continue, if the metformin origin story at the beginning of this video surprised you, if the mechanism behind garlic and hepatic glucose inhibition, or lentils, and 35% glucose reduction has shifted how you think about what is on your plate, hit the like button right now. This research is in published journals: Diabetes Care, Diabetologia, Journal of Nutrition. The evidence is real and accessible. It just does not reach people because there is no financial model for distributing food research without a product attached. Subscribe to Covenant Table. A new video every week. No agenda. The top 11 foods on this list have the strongest clinical evidence for blood sugar management of anything we have covered. Let us continue. Number 11. Vinegar. Vinegar appears throughout Scripture, in the Book of Ruth, in the Psalms, in the account of the crucifixion. The ancient world used vinegar as a condiment, a preservative, and a medicine. Ancient physicians prescribed diluted vinegar preparations for what they described as metabolic weakness and excessive thirst. The clinical evidence for vinegar's blood sugar effects is among the most well-replicated in nutritional research. A 2004 randomized crossover trial published in Diabetes Care, one of the premier clinical diabetes journals, tested apple cider vinegar consumption before a high-carbohydrate meal in subjects with insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. The findings: 20 milliliters of apple cider vinegar reduced postprandial blood glucose by 34% in insulin-resistant subjects and by 19% in type 2 diabetic subjects. The mechanism is dual. First, acetic acid inhibits alpha amylase and sucrase, the enzymes that break down starch and sucrose, slowing glucose release from food into the bloodstream. Second, acetic acid increases glucose uptake by muscle cells through AMPK activation, the same cellular energy sensor activated by fasting and by the pharmaceutical drug metformin itself. Metformin activates AMPK. Acetic acid in vinegar activates AMPK. The molecular target is identical. The delivery mechanism is a condiment that ancient biblical populations consumed daily. The ancient world dipped bread in vinegar at harvest meals. Modern research has confirmed they were simultaneously inhibiting carbohydrate digestion and activating insulin, mimicking cellular signaling. 2 mechanisms. 1 condiment. 3,000 years before the mechanism was understood. Number 10. Cinnamon. Cinnamon appears in Exodus, in Proverbs, in the Song of Solomon. Ancient Egyptian physicians imported it at enormous cost for both ritual and medical use. Ancient Ayurvedic and Chinese medical texts prescribe it specifically for conditions involving excessive thirst, frequent urination, and metabolic weakness, the classic symptom cluster of diabetes. The blood sugar evidence for cinnamon is one of the most debated in nutritional research, and I want to give you an honest account of that debate because the nuance matters. A landmark 2003 randomized controlled trial published in Diabetes Care by Alam Khan and colleagues tested cinnamon supplementation in type 2 diabetic subjects and found significant reductions in fasting blood glucose triglycerides, LDL cholesterol, and total cholesterol across all 3 doses tested. The results generated significant scientific interest. Subsequent trials showed mixed results, some confirming the effect, others finding weaker or no effect. A 2013 meta-analysis of 10 trials found overall significant reductions in fasting blood glucose, but with meaningful variation across studies. Here is the key nuance. The variation in results across trials correlates closely with the type of cinnamon used. Ceylon cinnamon, the true cinnamon referenced in ancient medical texts, shows consistent positive effects. Cassia cinnamon, the common grocery store variety from China and Vietnam, contains coumarin, which in high doses causes liver toxicity and may confound results. The ancient physicians who prescribed cinnamon from Sri Lanka, Ceylon cinnamon specifically, for metabolic conditions were working with the form that modern research consistently validates. The type of cinnamon matters. The ancient sources specified the type. Modern researchers, when they use the right type, consistently find the effect. The mechanism, cinnamaldehyde and procyanidins in Ceylon cinnamon activate insulin receptor signaling by phosphorylating insulin receptor substrate proteins, directly improving cellular insulin sensitivity at the receptor level. Number 9. Fenugreek. Fenugreek seeds appear in ancient Egyptian medical papyri. They are referenced in Talmudic literature. Ancient Ayurvedic texts prescribe them specifically for managing blood glucose and metabolic disorders. Every ancient medical tradition in the ancient Near East and South Asia that encountered fenugreek assigned it the same clinical application. The blood sugar mechanism for fenugreek is exceptionally well characterized. Fenugreek seeds contain an unusually high concentration of a soluble fiber called galactomannan, up to 45% of the seed by weight. Galactomannan forms a highly viscous gel in the gut that physically slows gastric emptying and glucose absorption more powerfully than most other dietary fibers studied. A 1990 randomized controlled trial published in the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition tested fenugreek seed supplementation in type 1 diabetic subjects, the more severe insulin-dependent form of the disease, and found significant reductions in fasting blood glucose, postprandial glucose, HbA1c, and urinary glucose excretion. Type 1 diabetes, not just type 2. Additionally, fenugreek contains 4-hydroxyisoleucine, an amino acid unique to fenugreek that directly stimulates glucose-dependent insulin secretion from pancreatic beta cells. It acts as an insulin secretagogue, stimulating insulin release, but only in the presence of elevated glucose, meaning it does not cause hypoglycemia at normal glucose levels. This is the same glucose-dependent mechanism targeted by the GLP-1 receptor agonist drug class. 3 mechanisms. Galactomannan slows glucose absorption. 4-hydroxyisoleucine stimulates glucose-dependent insulin secretion. And fenugreek's anti-inflammatory activity reduces the chronic inflammation that impairs insulin receptor signaling. Ancient physicians across 3 separate medical traditions prescribed fenugreek for metabolic disorders. Modern endocrinology has now identified 3 independent mechanisms by which it was working. Number 8. Bitter herbs. Specifically, the combination of bitter digestive herbs referenced in Exodus and throughout ancient Near Eastern medical texts. We established bitter compounds' role in gut health through TAS2R receptor activation, stimulating bile production, digestive enzyme secretion, and gut motility. In the blood sugar context, this matters for a specific reason. Bile acids are not only digestive agents, they are signaling molecules. When bile acids bind to the farnesoid X receptor, FXR, in the gut and liver, they activate a cascade of metabolic effects that include improved insulin sensitivity, reduced hepatic glucose production, and improved lipid metabolism. This is the mechanism behind a surprising finding: bariatric surgery, specifically gastric bypass, produces dramatic improvements in blood sugar and often complete remission of type 2 diabetes within days of surgery, before any significant weight loss has occurred. The mechanism, researchers discovered, is bile acid redistribution. The surgery changes bile acid flow in ways that activate FXR signaling and restore insulin sensitivity independently of weight. Bitter herbs stimulate bile production and flow through the gut in ways that activate the same FXR signaling pathway, at a lower level than surgery, but through a real and documented mechanism. Ancient physicians who prescribed bitter herbs before meals for metabolic conditions were stimulating FXR-mediated insulin sensitization through increased bile acid signaling. The ancient physicians knew the clinical outcome. Modern metabolic surgery research explained the molecular pathway. Number 7. The combination of flaxseed and black seed, and why their combination produces additive effects on blood sugar management. We established flaxseed's alpha-glucosidase inhibition and PPAR gamma activation. We established black seed's thymoquinone and AMPK activation. The reason this combination earns a joint position at 7 is that they address blood sugar through complementary mechanisms that do not overlap. Flaxseed acts in the gut, slowing glucose absorption through viscous fiber and activating PPAR gamma in adipose and muscle tissue. Black seed acts systemically, activating AMPK, reducing hepatic glucose output, and protecting pancreatic beta cells from oxidative damage. A 2019 randomized controlled trial, specifically testing the combination of flaxseed and Nigella sativa supplementation in type 2 diabetic subjects, found significantly greater reductions in fasting, blood glucose, HbA1c, and insulin resistance scores than either supplement produced independently. The ancient world consumed both seeds, flaxseed in bread and porridge, black seed as a spice and medicine, as a matter of daily dietary practice. The combination that modern research finds produces additive glycemic effects was embedded in the ancient dietary pattern, not as a design protocol, but as ordinary food. Number 6. Olive leaf. We established olive leaf's cardiovascular and anti-aging evidence in previous videos. In the blood sugar context, olive leaf earns number 6 because oleuropene's metabolic effects are exceptionally broad, and its head-to-head evidence against pharmaceutical comparators is striking. A 2013 randomized controlled trial published in PLOS One tested olive leaf extract against placebo in men with borderline high blood pressure, a population with high rates of concurrent insulin resistance. The olive leaf group showed significant reductions in insulin resistance, significant improvements in pancreatic beta cell secretory capacity, and significant reductions in fasting glucose compared to placebo. The mechanism: oleuropene activates AMPK, the same energy sensor activated by metformin and by vinegar's acetic acid, through a different molecular interaction. It also directly protects pancreatic beta cells from oxidative damage, the mechanism of progressive beta cell loss that drives the worsening of type 2 diabetes over time. As beta cells are destroyed by chronic oxidative stress and inflammation, the pancreas loses its ability to produce sufficient insulin. This progressive loss is the reason type 2 diabetes typically worsens over years, even with pharmaceutical management. Oleuropene's beta cell protection addresses the underlying mechanism of disease progression rather than only the symptomatic glucose elevation. Ancient Near Eastern physicians who prescribed olive leaf preparations for metabolic complaints were, without knowing it, both improving insulin sensitivity through AMPK activation and protecting the cellular source of insulin production from the oxidative damage that drives disease progression. Number 5. Black seed. Nigella sativa. In its full metabolic profile, we encountered black seed in the longevity and gut health videos. For blood sugar, it earns number 5 because the human clinical evidence is comprehensive across multiple independent trials. A 2010 randomized controlled trial, published in the Journal of Endocrinology and Metabolism, tested black seed supplementation in type 2 diabetic subjects over 12 weeks. The findings? Significant reductions in fasting, blood glucose, postprandial glucose, HbA1c, insulin resistance scores, and inflammatory markers simultaneously. A 2016 meta-analysis analyzed 10 randomized controlled trials of black seed in diabetic and pre-diabetic subjects and confirmed consistent, significant reductions in fasting glucose and HbA1c across all included trials. The mechanisms for black seed's blood sugar effects are multiple and well characterized. Thymoquinone activates AMPK, the metformin pathway. It increases GLUT4 expression on muscle cell surfaces, the glucose transporter that moves glucose from blood into muscle cells, the same target improved by exercise. It reduces TNF-alpha and IL-6, inflammatory cytokines that directly impair insulin receptor signaling, and it protects pancreatic beta cells through NRF2-mediated antioxidant defense. AMPK activation, GLUT4 upregulation, inflammatory cytokine reduction, beta cell protection. 4 mechanisms. 1 seed. Referenced in ancient medical texts across Egypt, India, and the ancient Near East for conditions that ancient physicians described in terms we now recognize as metabolic disease. Number 4 is, for the 3rd time in this series, not a food. It is the structured absence of food, and in the blood sugar context, its clinical evidence is stronger than any food on this list. The ancient world fasted. Moses, Daniel. The structured fasting protocols prescribed in biblical texts were embedded in religious practice, but produced metabolic effects that modern endocrinology has now extensively characterized. Fasting, specifically intermittent fasting and time-restricted eating, produces multiple synergistic improvements in blood glucose metabolism. During fasting, insulin levels drop dramatically, allowing cells to restore insulin sensitivity by downregulating the chronic insulin exposure that drives receptor desensitization. The liver depletes its glycogen stores, the stored glucose that contributes to elevated fasting blood glucose in type 2 diabetes, forcing it to shift to fat metabolism and reducing hepatic glucose output. A 2019 randomized controlled trial published in Cell Metabolism tested 12 weeks of time. Restricted eating, a daily 8-hour eating window, 16-hour fast, in men with metabolic syndrome. Without any dietary changes within the eating window, subjects showed significant reductions in fasting glucose, insulin resistance, blood pressure, and waist circumference. Fasting does not require medication. It does not require expensive foods. It requires only a consistent daily schedule. And it addresses insulin resistance at its root cause. Chronic insulin oversecretion in response to continuous eating, rather than managing its downstream consequences. Ancient populations fasted as a matter of religious and cultural practice. Modern metabolic research has confirmed that those regular fasting periods were protecting the insulin sensitivity of entire populations across generations. Number 3. Berberine-containing plants, specifically barberry, Berberis vulgaris, and related plants that appear in ancient Near Eastern botanical records. I am placing berberine-containing plants at number 3 because the clinical evidence for berberine is the strongest of any natural compound on this list, and the head-to-head trial data against metformin is remarkable. In 2008, a randomized controlled trial published in Metabolism, one of the premier endocrinology journals, directly compared berberine against metformin in 1116 type 2 diabetic subjects over 3 months. The results: berberine reduced HbA1c by 0%. Metformin reduced HbA1c by 2%. Statistically comparable performance. A plant compound versus the world's most prescribed diabetes drug. In a head-to-head randomized controlled trial, the berberine group additionally showed significant reductions in triglycerides and LDL cholesterol, effects that metformin does not produce as consistently. The mechanism: Berberine is a potent AMPK activator, the same primary mechanism as metformin. But berberine also inhibits alpha-glucosidase in the gut, increases GLUT4 expression in muscle cells, and reduces hepatic glucose production through a secondary pathway involving HNF4-alpha transcription factor inhibition. Multiple mechanisms converging on the same clinical outcome: lower blood glucose, improved insulin sensitivity, better lipid profiles. Barberry and related berberine-containing plants appear in ancient Near Eastern botanical medicine as treatments for what ancient physicians described in terms we recognize as metabolic and inflammatory disease. The 2008 head-to-head trial against metformin showed that ancient physicians had identified, through centuries of empirical observation, a plant compound that performs comparably to the world's most prescribed diabetes drug. Number 2. Not a single food, but the specific combination of lentils and bitter herbs consumed together daily, as the ancient world consumed them. Here is why this combination belongs at number 2. We established lentils-resistant starch and its 35% reduction in postprandial glucose. We established bitter herbs bile acid stimulation and FXR-mediated insulin sensitization. When consumed together, these two mechanisms are additive. Resistant starch from lentils slows glucose absorption and produces short-chain fatty acids that improve GLP-1 secretion. Bitter herb compounds simultaneously stimulate bile flow that activates FXR-mediated hepatic insulin sensitivity. One intervention addresses postprandial glucose absorption. The other addresses hepatic insulin resistance. Neither mechanism overlaps. A 2022 dietary pattern study examining Mediterranean-adjacent dietary patterns, which closely resemble the ancient biblical dietary pattern, found that the combination of high legume consumption with high bitter vegetable and herb consumption produced synergistic improvements in fasting glucose, postprandial glucose, and insulin sensitivity that exceeded the effects predicted by adding the individual food effects together. Synergy. The combination produces results greater than the sum of its parts, because the mechanisms do not overlap. The ancient world ate lentil stew with bitter herbs as a dietary staple. This was not a designed metabolic protocol. It was the ordinary food of ancient populations. And what those populations were eating was, by every modern endocrinological measure, one of the most comprehensive natural blood glucose management protocols available. Number 1 is the whole, not a single food, the complete ancient dietary pattern for blood sugar management, and why the pattern outperforms every individual food on this list. Just as the Stanford study showed, the dietary pattern outperforms individual foods for gut health. Let me assemble what we have covered today. Cucumbers and onions at every meal. Dual alpha-glucosidase and alpha-amylase inhibition, reducing postprandial glucose absorption. Lentils as the primary carbohydrate source. Resistant starch producing 35% reductions in postprandial glucose and gut bacterial fermentation, improving GLP-1 secretion. Vinegar as a daily condiment. AMPK activation mimicking metformin's primary mechanism, plus alpha-amylase inhibition, producing 34% reductions in postprandial glucose in insulin-resistant subjects. Garlic daily. Hepatic glucose production inhibition, the same primary target as metformin. Olive oil as the primary cooking fat. GLP-1 stimulation and 40% reduction in new-onset diabetes over 5 years in the Remedies trial. Fenugreek in bread and cooking, galactomannan, slowing glucose absorption, and 4-hydroxyisoleucine stimulating glucose-dependent insulin secretion. Black seed, AMPK activation, GLUT4 upregulation, beta cell protection, and head-to-head clinical performance comparable to metformin. Bitter herbs before meals, FXR, mediated insulin sensitization through bile acid signaling, structured fasting periods, insulin receptor resensitization, and hepatic glycogen depletion. Every one of these mechanisms is independent. None overlaps with another. Together, they address blood sugar through 9 distinct molecular pathways simultaneously, more pathways than any single pharmaceutical intervention targets. Metformin primarily activates AMPK and inhibits hepatic glucose production. One mechanism. The complete ancient dietary pattern activates AMPK, inhibits alpha-glucosidase, inhibits alpha-amylase, stimulates GLP-1 secretion, activates FXR, upregulates GLUT4, inhibits hepatic glucose production, stimulates glucose-dependent insulin secretion, and restores insulin receptor sensitivity through periodic fasting. 9 mechanisms. No prescription. No side effects. No cost beyond groceries. This is what the ancient world ate, not as a protocol, as food. The medieval physicians who prescribed French lilac for sweet urine disease 700 years before Baghetti synthesized metformin were not operating on the fringe of medical knowledge. They were practicing the most evidence-consistent tradition of metabolic medicine available, a tradition that went back thousands of years to the physicians of Egypt, Israel, India, and Greece, all of whom had identified through empirical observation the foods and practices that kept blood sugar under control in populations that had no other options. The pharmaceutical industry looked at French lilacs and built a drug. The ancient world built a diet. The diet addressed 9 mechanisms simultaneously. The drug addresses 1. Modern endocrinology is only now building the research infrastructure to understand why the diet worked so well. 21 foods. 9 molecular mechanisms. 3,000 years of clinical observation. I want to be precise about something important. Nothing in this video is a recommendation to stop taking metformin or any prescribed diabetes medication. If you are managing type 2 diabetes with pharmaceutical support, that management is between you and your doctor. What this video demonstrates is that the foods on this list have genuine clinical evidence for addressing the same biological mechanisms as the drugs prescribed for blood sugar management. They are not alternatives that replace medical care. They are foundations that address root causes, and that ancient populations used, with documented clinical efficacy, long before pharmaceutical options existed. The world's most prescribed diabetes drug came from a plant medieval physicians were already using correctly. The question is not whether ancient medicine had answers to blood sugar management. The evidence says it did. The question is whether modern medicine, pharmaceutical dependence, and the absence of nutritional education and clinical training has left the majority of the 150 million people taking metformin today unaware of the dietary foundation that clinical research consistently validates. The ancient table had the answer. It has always had the answer. If today's video changed how you think about blood sugar management, if the metformin origin story, the 35% lentil result, the berberine head-to-head trial made you want to change something on your plate this week, hit the like button. Subscribe to Covenant Table for this research every week. No sponsors, no supplements, no agenda. And I want your comment on this specific question, because your answer shapes what I cover next. Are you currently managing blood sugar through diet, medication, or both? Drop your situation in the comments. Not a diagnosis, just the general picture. I read every comment. The combination of responses I get from this question tells me exactly what to research next. Whether that is the specific protocol for combining these foods with existing medication, or the evidence for reversing prediabetes through diet alone. Next week on Covenant Table, I am covering the ancient immunity protocol, the specific foods that ancient armies and physicians used to protect entire populations from infection, and what virology research has confirmed about each one.